Good morning, everybody, and thanks for tuning in to How'd They Do It? Tech in the Cities, which is the weekly podcast by City and State. And I'm here today with my esteemed co-host, Julie Samuels of Tech NYC. Good morning, Julie.
Hey, Tom, I'm esteemed now. This is an upgrade. An
I,
upgrade.
I could have called you the Honorable Julie Samuels. Um, but before we get into our episode, which is a fun one, I just want to thank our sponsors quickly: Uber, Spectrum, Civic Hall, TikTok, Google, DoorDash, and Snapchat. That's an all-star lineup of tech companies, and we really appreciate all their support throughout this series. This is our last episode in series one. We're going to actually do a part two series later this spring. We'll get into that in a few minutes. But today's guest is Theo Yedinsky, who's the Vice President of Public Policy at Airbnb, who's obviously in the news a lot. Julie, tell us what's going on there.
Yeah, I mean, I thought this conversation with Theo was so interesting on a couple fronts. But, first of all, home sharing, Airbnb specifically, has changed so much about the modern city and the modern travel experience.
Mm-hmm.
Cities, including New York, are really grappling with what that means and how to handle that dynamic. And I think it's really important to have these conversations to get a better sense of the best way forward and one thing that came out of this, the best way forward is not the same for every city. Theo's
Right.
really interesting when he kind of talks about what works, for instance, in San Diego doesn't work in New York City. And I think that's a really important thing to remember.
I agree. Listen, and I'm obsessed with home sharing from a different perspective, and I think I brought this up briefly with Theo at the end of the episode, which is, couldn't we come up with a home sharing idea for long-term home sharing, right? I read somewhere I think it was The Economist a couple of years ago, that there's a million unused bedrooms in New York City, and we have such a huge housing crisis and affordability crisis. And on top of that, I think, you've got this loneliness crisis among seniors, and there's who knows how many of those million unused bedrooms are in apartments of seniors. Couldn't we come up with an intergenerational idea of pairing students or post-college people who come to New York with seniors who are looking for companionship, maybe obviously to make a couple extra dollars and help in their home. And anyway, so I think that's something that is worth exploring, and I hope our elected leaders are looking at that.
Yeah, I think at the highest level, it's clear that the current setup is not working.
Mm-hmm.
Hotels are outrageously expensive. Tourism is so important to the city. Housing, as you just said, I don't need to tell anyone that housing is a significant challenge for the city and for the whole country. And it's really about taking a step back and trying to understand where there's opportunity to meet the city where it is and where it needs to go. So that's what this conversation is about.
Yeah, and I think it's a red herring that people talk about, oh, Airbnb is taking apartments off the market, so it's contributing to the affordability crisis. Well, that's really like a very small percentage of these
I think
units.
that's completely right. And I think it's really problematic that hotels are so expensive right now. It's
Exactly.
really hard for people to come
Right.
to New York.
Right. It's good news that New York is now a popular place once again, and we have record tourism, but we're going to scare people away if those prices don't come down.
Yeah, the last thing I'll say, and then we should talk about our next series for sure. But, obviously people who want to rent out their own homes are New Yorkers, but so many people who rely on Airbnb aren't New Yorkers. They don't vote here. They're not a voting bloc. They're not politically organized, but it is so important that we continue to attract tourists to the city. It is a major economic engine for New York, and we've got to figure out a way to expand that pool across the 5 boroughs as well, not just in Midtown. So that's what this conversation is about.
Exactly. No, exactly. And listen, this has been a fascinating series, Julie, and thank you so much for partnering with us on this. It's really been such a pleasure to work with you. We've had some really interesting people on the show, and I've gotten some great feedback from our listeners, and I'm sure you've gotten feedback as well. So, we've been putting our heads together, and I think, our next series, I mean, the two letters that I hear in the alphabet these days more than any are AI.
What are you talking about?
And it seems like it's pervasive, and it's either the future of civilization or the end of civilization, depending on your perspective. So I think what we'd like to do, and you and I'll figure this out over the next couple of weeks, is later this spring do a series on AI and its impact on New York and in the future. Maybe we can call it AI 2030, and look at what New York might look like in 2030 when AI is fully baked into the economy and fully baked into our lives every day.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea. And I guess we'd ask listeners, those of you listening now, let us know. Does that sound good? Does that sound bad? Do you have ideas for who we should talk to if that's what we go ahead with? Like Tom said, we've got some time to get this right. We'd be very interested in hearing from you.
Yeah, please send us topics, send us guests that you'd love to hear from, any feedback, and obviously feedback to this series. So thanks for listening, and we're gonna go right into Theo Yedinsky from Airbnb.
Theo, we're so excited to have you. This is a really important conversation for our city and our state in this moment.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, Theo. So just to start off, so our listeners understand a little bit more about you and Airbnb. Can you just tell us a little about yourself and what you do at Airbnb?
Sure, sure, of course. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to be here. Nice to see you again, Julie. So my name is Theo Yedinsky. I am the Vice President of Public Policy at Airbnb. I'm also a proud Brooklynite. So issues that concern the city and state of New York are near and dear to my heart. I worked for a number of years prior to coming to Airbnb in Democratic politics in different ways in DC and in California. And so I transitioned into the tech world because I had been doing politics out in California and got interested in the intersection of technology and politics, going all the way back to actually the Howard Dean campaign and early blogging. So I
Wow.
was always fascinated about that, and that led me to where I am now. And since we're on the verge of the Super Bowl, I don't know when this is airing, so maybe it's airing after the Super Bowl. I'm also a big Eagles fan, so go Birds.
Oh,
That may not excite all of the New Yorkers that might listen
no,
to it.
no. I'm a second Barkley fan, so I'm actually
There you
eager
go.
for the Eagles to win.
Great.
Theo, I read something on the internet this week. I believe everything you read on the internet that kids who were born the day after Howard Dean's scream are old enough to vote now.
That's true, right? Because that would have been in probably February of 2004.
Yeah, exactly.
I wasn't. We're going to obviously spend a lot of time talking about home sharing and Airbnb and the work you've done here in New York and in other places, but I want to dig into something you said just for a second. I think you and I came up in similar times. There were a lot of people who, worked in and out of Democratic politics and in and out of tech policy land. And there's a whole cohort of us who did that. And it's changed a lot since we started our work.
It has changed a lot.
And I guess around the time you were shifting over to tech policy, so was I, and it felt so idealistic. And I think it still does in many ways feel idealistic, but it's not the same. And I'm just kind of wondering how you think about that shift.
It's a great question. Look, I think part of the Democratic Party, has to do a better job understanding some of the technological revolutions that are going on right now, right? I think, there's been a lot of skepticism about crypto policy, right? And I think, part of the frustration from the tech community with the administration was that they were litigating it and criminalizing it prior to having a conversation about, was there a regulatory framework around it? I worry a little bit that the same conversation is happening around AI, right? I think there are a lot of potential benefits with artificial intelligence, with agents, everybody having a personal tutor, right? And having an incredibly smart computer, even smarter than your phone, to help you, in your daily life and educate you. And I think there's a lot of really great opportunities that come with those, technological changes. I mean, certainly, the crypto work, I think, has great opportunity for distributing finance and creating economic opportunity. And I think part of what we've gotten into this space as the sort of, technology Democrats is we got frustrated about, what happened and what has happened in social media. We got frustrated around the politics of that. We've got frustrated around the impact of, that content and how the algorithms work. And we've lost sight a little bit about what the upside is, both in terms of our economics and in terms of the way it could change society. And I think one of the things that I loved about, the era you're talking about, Julie, and maybe even before that, right, was I thought that, Bill Clinton and Al Gore really created a vision about what the world could look like and how to think about that, how technology could empower that and create that world. And I think we've lost a little bit of that and we've gotten a little too negative on it. And there needs to be a bit of a rebalancing. And I think, look, it's our responsibility also to paint a vision about what the world could look like and why, and then how you have to govern to that. And we've gotten a little bit into the sort of anti-space without painting the vision. And I think that's part of one of our challenges, is to really articulate a vision about how all of these things, what the opportunity of them is really.
Great. Just to take this a little bit from the macro to the micro, tell us a little bit about Airbnb's sort of long-term goals in New York City, and how does Airbnb plan to contribute to the city's future?
Yeah.
Where do you see its role?
This is a great question. I mean, I love this question, as I noted, as a proud Brooklynite now, and my wife was born and raised in Brooklyn. So Airbnb's role in the community is also personal to me. So I think, first of all, I definitely want to be clear that as a company, we've worked with regulators all over the country and all over the world, right? We haven't been a company that's been an anti-regulatory company, and we think that creating regulatory frameworks around new products, right, is important. So to that extent, we want to work with governments. That's been our position. We want to be a valued and constructive member of the community. I think we've moved from sort of upstart to moving into that space where, as a company, Airbnb is becoming more of an institution. And I think, look, honestly, LA is kind of a great example about this. And I don't know if you've all been following, what's been going on in LA, obviously with the fires, but Airbnb's role there. We've put in a little over $25 million to help with disaster relief. Hosts opened up their homes for fire victims in the emergency. Airbnb.org has been housing thousands of people. I think we're up over 20,000 people right now. I don't know the exact number. We worked with the government, with the Attorney General there, to prevent price gouging on the platform, so that people who lost their home, didn't get, subjected to price gouging. And so, I think that's a great example about how Airbnb can be critical infrastructure and work with communities in times of need. It will make New York City more affordable, both for those who live here, because they can get money from hosting to help them with school or healthcare costs or their mortgage, and also, for those to be able to travel to the city, which has become incredibly expensive right now, right? I mean, I think one of the big things is New York City is such an iconic place in the world that it shouldn't be just for the rich. And now, on some levels, it's becoming that way, both to live here, and to travel here. And I think that's a valuable change that we can help make. So very interested in being a long-term member of the community, both in Manhattan and in the outer boroughs. And obviously, it's a personal interest to me, living here.
I want to I definitely want to talk about the legislation at the council, but before that, I want to dig in just for a second on, you were talking earlier about how we've a little bit lost the narrative of tech as kind of the more positive conversation around tech and what it enables for cities and states and people, and what that vision is for Airbnb specifically. Like, if you could basically pitch Airbnb, pitch home sharing
Right.
with a blank slate, like, how would you start with explaining the value for a city like New York, which is obviously unique in so many ways?
Yeah. Look, I think, I'll say this: Airbnb arguably is one of the greatest mass economic empowerment engines of all time. So let's start there, right? We've created $200 billion of economics for our hosts all over the world. These are regular, everyday people who live in these communities, right? They go to work, right? They have mortgages, their kids are going to school, they have healthcare, and you're helping them take their asset, and you're helping them, take their liability and turn it into an asset to help them cover costs of living. I think, in a world where women continue to make 83 cents on the dollar, over 60% of hosts on Airbnb are women. So, not only is Airbnb one of the greatest economic empowerment engines of all time, it's one of the greatest economic empowerment engines for women all over the world of all time. Almost 20% of our hosts in the US are seniors. So at a time when, your income is winding down, right? Airbnb has become a popular tool for seniors to help cover costs. Also, I think, for the seniors, it's connection with the world. Years ago, I did this, and this is not a New York example, so forgive me, but I interviewed this host in Sydney, Australia. Her name was Mary, and she talked about how her husband had passed away, and Airbnb helped her cover the bills. But what was more important to her than that was the connection that she had felt with all the people that she had met, opening up her home to host. And I think, in a world where people are becoming more isolated and more online, Airbnb allows us to create connections, in real life in a way that is challenging these days. So I think it has, intrinsic personal and social connection value. I think it's a tremendous economic empowerment engine for regular people as opposed to, big corporations, right? I mean, obviously Airbnb is a big company, but the vast majority of the economics goes to the hosts, 97%. And then last but not least, I think just touching back on the LA example, um, I think, Airbnb can be an incredibly critical part of the infrastructure of cities and communities to help them in times of need, right? So, I mean, honestly, the Open Homes program and Airbnb.org came out of Sandy, which probably many people don't know, right? Which was that, when Sandy happened, Airbnb hosts opened their home, and that was the, to help victims, and that became the idea of Airbnb.org. And you see that play out now in LA. So look, I've spent my whole life working in democratic politics. Part of what was important to me in the corporate space was, working for a company that I thought, created a lot of value in the world and did a lot of good.
Tom can ask a question, but can quickly respond and say one other thing that I always thought about was so smart about getting Airbnb right for cities who have like, when you think about tourism as a market and you think about large events, you might not have the hotel inventory
Right.
to do a large event. I mean, I think about all the times I usually stay at an Airbnb is when I go to something in a mid-sized city and the
Yeah.
hotels sell out and it like allows you to expand capacity for like a one-time thing or once a year thing. And it's like just makes total sense.
And by the way, in addition to that, all the local people who live there
Want to get out of town. Yeah. They want to leave.
right?
Yeah.
So, right. So I think, look, events are another great example, and certainly events have helped propel Airbnb. Look, I mean, if you ask Brian and Nate and Joe, and when they started, people would say it was crazy, the idea that people would stage in those homes, right? I mean, a lot of VCs passed. But I just think, in general, that's it's just such a phenomenal use case for Airbnb in a world that's so much more isolated and online. And I think our ability to connect online and offline attributes, I think, will be a really important part of the company going forward. And then to your point on the events, it's like you had the solar eclipse. I don't know if you've ever seen that, but you could see the reservation bookings follow the eclipse, which I think is great for those communities that would have a hard time monetizing that. And so there's so many great examples on the events.
How are you and Airbnb working with some local officials who bring up the concerns like, high rents in the city or low occupancy rates and housing affordability in general? That's obviously what's being used against Airbnb as arguments for limiting. Is there things that you can do or that Airbnb is doing to work with local officials on ameliorating that?
Well, Tom, maybe I might take take a stab at the premise of the question first before I would talk about the work we're
Sure.
doing, which is that there's sort of this misnomer that Airbnb is a cause of the housing crisis here. I think that that's really not true. And 1 year after Local Law 18 passed, there was a data study that was put out that shows basically Airbnb's impact on the housing economy in New York City is negligible. And one of the most interesting parts of this was that in neighborhoods that had a higher percentage of Airbnbs, that the availability had gone down and the cost of rent had gone up faster than it had in other neighborhoods, which is the opposite of what you would expect to see, right? Like if Airbnb was having impact on the housing prices, the neighborhoods that had the most Airbnbs, in theory, once they weren't there, should see the largest increase in availability and maybe a lower increase in the rent costs. And that simply just wasn't the case in the data. So, part of me wants to push back on this initial sort of assumption that Airbnb is is a cause in the housing crisis. The reality is that New York needs to build about 500,000 homes over the next 10 years. There's 3.2 million housing units in New York City, and even at its peak, if you assume that the Airbnbs all took a house off the market, which is not true because people are only renting it temporarily, right? A lot of those don't go back on the long-term market. You're talking less than 0.2% of the housing accommodations in the city. So there's this misnomer, I think, that sort of Airbnb has an outsized impact on the housing market, and it's actually not true. But I think our opponents have done a very good job of pushing those issues. Having said that, look, I mean, we are very interested in investing in housing programs in the city and being part of the solution here. And we continue to talk to a lot of the housing groups about how we can do that. and what are some new and innovative ways to do that. I think also part of it is the idea around critical infrastructure. So, we definitely want to be a positive force in the community for the long term. New York City has housing challenges. They need a tremendous amount of supply going forward. And we continue to look for ways to do that. I think there's some innovative ideas that are, percolating around New York City right now.
When you're looking across the country or even across the world, because one of the things that I think is really interesting about this work is that every city's a little different. They all, it's each one is unique in that it has its own opportunities and challenges and et cetera. Where do you think we're getting it right now? What do you look at as a good example of how to find the path forward?
It's a great question. One of the nice things about this job is, we have political challenges in some amazing places. So I do get
You get to go there,
I
yeah.
do get to go there, which is a really, which is a nice side benefit that I didn't anticipate. Well, look, I think, I think it's important to take a step back and think about, regulating new things in the world, right? So, we always sort of joke about this, right? If you probably look at some of the early regulations around cars, they would seem crazy today. So I think, you've been in the early stages of the regulatory framework around the sharing economy the last 5 to 10 years. And I think one of the things that we haven't gotten right is that we've applied a broad brush to problems in cities that really only impact one or two neighborhoods. And so I think a place that's gotten it right, that's been thinking about this, is interestingly San Diego. And there's a couple things about San Diego that I think make a lot of sense, which is one, the regulation is tiered, so they don't treat all the hosts the same, right? I mean, I think there's a lot of politicians who say they want the average person, the regular mom and pop, to be able to put their apartment or put their house on Airbnb when they go away on vacation and make a little extra money. But a lot of times the rules, the registration requirements, I mean, this is certainly true about New York City, are extremely complicated. So it actually doesn't enable people to do it casually and to help make ends meet. So I think part of what San Diego got right is they think about the tiering. Right. So if the people are doing it very casually or not very often, they could have one set of rules and registration requirements. And for those that are doing it, as a small business or entrepreneur, they would have a different set of requirements. So I think that's really important. The other thing that I think San Diego did well is they didn't treat every neighborhood the same. So like if you're in Mission Viejo, which is a traditional vacation neighborhood, you can have a much higher percentage of Airbnbs that are part of the housing stock. And that number is different from what the citywide percentage is. So I think that's an interesting way of looking at it, which is that you're tiering the type of regulation. So you're enabling, you or I to do it if we wanted to go on vacation, but you're also taking into account those who are doing it more seriously as a business. And then I think the other thing that happened in the early stages is, Airbnbs, can be concentrated in a few neighborhoods, but that's not true for the whole city. And so in a lot of places, they've made rules for the whole city that really only make sense for one or two neighborhoods. And I think that's something that needs to get dealt with going forward. That will enable, growth and economic opportunity for lots of people in, cities and towns all over the world, but will also help, get a better regulatory framework, so cities feel like they have a good balance in the community.
It seems so obvious how we would treat different neighborhoods across the 5 boroughs to me.
It does. It does. But look, I mean, in all fairness, I think, look, figuring out short-term rental regulation, early on was complicated. I think,
Yeah.
was, one of the, I mean, to speak to the question about technology and Democrats and sort of how we think about cities going forward, there's a bit of a tendency to take old rules and try to apply them to new things. That's especially true in a competitive landscape, right? Where other, other businesses that have been in this space for a longer time feel like the rules are different. It's anti-competitive for them. But the reality is that, you need to try and figure out how to make new rules for new things. I mean, I think this is true around AI. It was true around crypto. I think it was true around the sharing economy. And, maybe we haven't been the best at that. And I think, having a narrative about how this, helps the cities and where the world is going in this space would be important. And, I think that's been one of the challenges, but it's hard, you know what I mean? I mean, these are, people trying to solve, I mean, everybody has good intentions, they're trying to do the best they can in this space, and it's sometimes things are complicated to figure out. But I do think the rules going forward need to be simpler. They need to be easier to use. They need to think about the neighborhoods versus the whole city, and we need to be able to let people do this casually and think that there's different layers. I think that'll be really important for going forward to unlock the economic opportunity that comes with sharing platforms.
I have a quick question. You mentioned before that there's some creative ideas around sort of solving New York's housing crisis. There's one thing that has always intrigued me, and I believe there's a smaller tech company called PadSplit that's working on sort of long-term home sharing. And I think I read once in The Economist that there's 1 million unused bedrooms in the five boroughs, which struck me.
5 boroughs.
Yeah, I mean, I believe it was the five boroughs, may have been all of New York State, but I think it was New York City. And I was very intrigued by that because I thought, wow, I believe PadSplit started in Atlanta, and they worked with some of the local elected leaders there to rezone certain neighborhoods so that there could be long-term home sharing. Um, in your experience, is this something that, I mean, A, is it something that Airbnb has looked at? And B, is it something you think that is a viable partial solution to New York City's affordability crisis? I mean, to me also, you've got a lot of seniors who are facing a loneliness crisis. And if there was a
Yeah.
way to pair those people with people looking for affordable housing and do it in obviously a safe and efficient way, then you could unlock a percentage of these million unused bedrooms.
It's a great question, Tom, and there was, and a fascinating topic, by the way. And there was also, I think, a story about this issue nationally recently
Mm-hmm.
that talked about the number of unused bedrooms in homes, and also how much bigger the homes that were being built these days are compared to the way they used to be. So I think there's a lot of,
Do you remember where that story was? Do you remember?
I thought it was in the Times, honestly,
Okay,
but
okay.
I will find it
If
and
you can, I'd love to see that.
yeah. But look, I think there's a lot of big issues like this that exist, right? So the other one is the number of unused apartments in New York City,
Yes.
right? I think the last time the press reported on it, maybe the number was 88,000, which is just a humongous number of homes that already exist that are sitting fallow. And there's not a lot of discussion about how to change that, right? I mean, that's a huge issue. By the way, that issue is an issue all over the world. It's an issue it's an issue in Paris, right? It's an issue in different parts of Italy where you have unused and fallow homes where they don't have tenants in them. And so that's a big challenge. I think, the size of the the size of the homes that we're building. So look, I think one thing, to bring it back to Airbnb, something that a lot of people don't know about Airbnb is a lot of our stays are actually over 30 days and have been for years. Roughly 20% of our business is actually 30-day plus. So there is a big connection there. We do continue to think about that challenge, and is there a way for us to have opportunity around that as a business, but also helps solve some social challenges there. But yeah, Airbnb does have a pretty extensive 30-day plus longer term stay business that just doesn't get talked about as much, that fits in exactly what you're talking about. I think there's a lot of other issues that need to be addressed in the housing space, because the reality is we just simply need a lot more homes. I think the city has estimated 500,000 homes over 10 years. So that's 50,000 houses a year. Now, I don't know if any of you have seen the Gowanus project, which is pretty large. That's about 10,000 units. So you need 5 of those a year,
Right.
for 10 years for the city to meet its housing needs. So some of that can come from unused apartments. Some of that can come from these rooms. But when you think about the scale of that versus, sort of what Airbnb's actual activity is in the city, it's a pretty big difference.
I mean, it's so interesting to me because some Airbnb is uniquely premised on, obviously, on the idea of sharing,
Yes.
right? Like culturally, and in its earliest days, it's
Yes.
all about sharing, and so much of so many of the challenges in increasing the stock of homes, especially in a city as dense as New York, like the antithesis of sharing,
Yeah.
and there's like a real cultural uh, challenge here that we see. It's this whole like YIMBY NIMBY thing. It's the same, but we're living in a really weird moment about on those issues?
Look, there used to be a lot of, what they call SRO housing, single room occupancy, which was essentially shared, right? You'd have a room and a communal bathroom. And there's a lot, there's a lot of startups in this space.
Yeah.
We're talking
Yeah.
that, are looking to build that type of community around, sharing homes together, right? Sharing space. So I think it's a big
topic.
issue that needs to be addressed.
Theo, I wanted to kind of take a second and take a step back from the conversation around the regulatory debate, which is obviously incredibly important. But sometimes I worry that we spend so much time talking about that we also are failing to talk about the promise, to talk about the future, to talk about what's coming in travel tech, in home sharing specifically. Like, what's exciting? I know that Airbnb is a company that spends a ton of time thinking about innovation and investment in building and where we're going. So I'm wondering if there's anything you're particularly excited about.
Well, I think it's a great question. I think maybe I might back up even one more layer, which is, travel is an amazing experience, right? I mean, most people find travel transformative. When you're coming of age, you think about, traveling after school, right? When you want to learn more and experience the world, you think about traveling, right? And more people can travel now than have ever been able to travel before, right? And I think, again, in a world where it's increasingly more online, the ability to go to these places, see these places, meet people, that can only be a good thing in the world, right? I mean, there's going to be a lot of human beings on this planet, and we all need to be able to, to live and work together and get to know one another. And so travel, I think, is a powerful theme in society going forward. I think part of what, we need to think about as a tech company, but also in that space, is how we take that and take the benefits of that and put that back into making sure the communities are okay. And this is where the sort of the regulatory conversation comes in. I think, look, Florence has been innovative in this, and they take the tourism dollars and they've built an incredible, light rail system for the city, right? So I think, when you think about ways that traveling is really good for humanity and society and for people, how do we think about ways to take the benefits of that and invest that into the communities that that we're going to visit, to make sure they remain vibrant, to make sure they have opportunity, that they can grow? And I think that's a big challenge going forward, that a lot of cities and big tourism areas around the world are thinking about right now. But I think that's an aspirational growth point of view that tech companies can help foster in the space, because it's only going to get more interesting once you get AI into it, right? There'll only be more possibilities, and more interesting. And so it's going to continue to grow. People are going to want to continue to see the world. People should continue to see the world. And we need to think about how we enable that, because that's good for society. But then also, I think there needs to be a really big conversation in how we use the economics around that to give back into those communities so that they can, sustain themselves and thrive, and that I think is a really important conversation.
I think that's great. That totally resonates with me.
Yeah. There's lots of people who've done great jobs in this around the world. And I think, New York could do this too, right?
Right.
When you think about it, New York State, it could help repair the MTA or other issues, right?
This has been a great conversation. Thank you so much, Theo, for your time. Thanks for tuning in and being with us for the entire series. Once again, it's been a pleasure to work with Julie Samuels from Tech NYC. Want to thank our sponsors, Uber, Spectrum, Civic Hall, TikTok, Google, DoorDash, and Snapchat. Julie, you want to have the final word?
My final word would be like and subscribe to this podcast on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, iHeart, or wherever you get your podcasts.
And give us your ideas for our next series, which is going to be focusing on AI in New York City and what AI is going to look like in New York in 2030. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.